Good morning, boys and girls. Today we're going to talk about dialogue, point of view, and perspective. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is point of view. Now, I know this is going to be a review for most of you, but I wanted to get back to it because we're going to be doing some really fun activities today based on point of view. So there are two types of point of view in fourth grade that fourth graders need to know. First and third person point of view. Point of view narration is referring to who is telling the story. Is the narrator a character in the story? Or is the narrator observing the story and not a character? Just a quick message about this too is these are very easy to tell. Like you should know in the first few pages what the narrated point of view is in a story. Okay, first person. The narrator is in the story and is usually the main character. So first person point of view, boys and girls, the character will be, the narrator will be a character in the story and will refer to themselves with words using I, me, and my. Now, third person, you're going to see those words I, me, and my, but a character has to be talking. And then you might think, well, Mr. Radish, how do we know a character is talking? Well, I'll talk about that in a minute when we get to dialogue. The narrator is not in the story in third person, meaning that they're off in the distance somewhere. They're observing from a safe distance, but they are not an active character in the story. They will never refer to themselves when the narrator is speaking, that is. So you won't see those words, I, me, and my. There are two types of third-person point of view. Now, this is a little bit beyond fourth grade. This is going into more fifth and sixth grade language arts. But there are two different types of third-person point of view that if you guys want to start challenging yourself as you're reading, you can start figuring out, because most stories that you read are in third person. And because first person, it's a little messy. A third person point of view story, in my opinion, and in most writers' opinion, that's why most stories are written in third person. It's just easier to narrate. It's easier to organize thoughts and to kind of split them in between. When it's first person point of view, it just seems like, characters are talking a lot. There's a lot of dialogue in it, and sometimes it's a little harder to follow. So limited and omniscient are the two types of third person point of view. We'll talk about that here. So third person limited and omniscient. Third person limited. This narrator knows everything about the main character, including his thoughts or her thoughts and actions. So third person limited, that narrator knows everything there is to know about the main character. Okay? Their thoughts, what they do, every second, as if you were that person, but they're not that person because they're third person, remember? They're not that character. Now, third person omniscient means the narrator knows everything about every character. This type of narrator knows the thoughts and actions of every character and describes them to the reader. So throughout the story, every story is going to have, multiple characters, lots of characters. The difference is third person limited, it's just going to talk about other characters and how they interact with the main character and how the main character feels about those interactions. However, third person omniscient will say more along the lines of, okay, here's how this character feels, here's how this character feels, this is exactly what this character is doing at this moment, and they just know everything about everything. So it gives more information to the reader, and you might think to yourself like, oh man, that would be really cool to know it. But the problem is, and the reason why not all narrators do that is because maybe they don't want you to know what the other characters are doing as the reader. They want there to be a little bit more of a focus on just the main character rather than what are all these, less significant characters are doing. So it's trying to give you what thoughts exactly they want you to be thinking and to be focused on. Now let's talk about dialogue. What is it and how do we add it to our stories? So any strong author knows exactly how to use dialogue and knows when to use dialogue, and knowing that too much dialogue is a problem. Okay, there has to be lulls between dialogue. If you have a story that's literally all dialogue, it's not a story. That's called a script, and we talked about that in drama. Okay, so narrators are the storyteller. okay? And they need to play a big role in a story. Dialogue is a key piece to a story, but it should not be the main focus of your story, should not be the dialogue. However, in some stories, some especially short stories, you'll notice there's a lot more dialogue in short stories because there's a lot of stuff that needs to take place in very little time. And the narrator just plays a little, facilitating role where he's kind of like, okay, let me explain this, set up this scene, and then here we go. Let the characters go at it. However, if you're reading a novel, it's a long story. The narrator is the dominant voice in that story, and they will be explaining and talking most of the time. There might be a significant amount of dialogue, but it's not going to be all dialogue. So what is dialogue? Dialogue is what we call characters talking to each other in writing. That is what dialogue is called. Okay. Words coming out of the character's mouth or noises plus a speaker tag equals dialogue. Now, I talked to you guys about this. This should be review for most of you because we've talked about dialogue before. But words coming out of the character's mouth or noises and the speaker tag. A speaker tag is the he replied or she said or the boy bragged or she whined. Those are speaker tags. It's basically telling me who is speaking this dialogue, because you cannot just have a sentence that is said from one of the characters and not explain who it came from. And I have a problem if you just keep saying said for every single speaker tag. That is really boring, and I actually do not like that. So you need to focus on different ones. Well, what kind of ones do we have? So how do we write dialogue? So what are you doing right now? You also need to add a speaker tag before you're finished adding dialogue. So this is how it would look. Speaker tag is when the narrator informs the reader who is speaking in the story. What are you doing right now? Mr. Radish asked. You don't underline it. I just underline it to emphasize it. So that is how it should appear. Okay. So what are you doing right now? Mr. Radish asked. I did not say Mr. Radish said. It's because I didn't say it. I asked a question. So Mr. Radish asked. See how you can switch the speaker tag there to make it fit what your dialogue is doing. So how do I write with dialogue? Dialogue should be used to help carry the story forward, and in addition to the narrator's explanation of what is happening. So your dialogue should have a point to it, okay? Not just because you feel like a character should say something. What is the character going to say? Is it important to the story? Will it drive the story forward? Will it bring clarity to the situation that's happening? Like that, these are all questions you need to ask yourself. Is this good dialogue I'm adding? Your story should not be dominated by dialogue. It's very helpful to have a narrator explain what is happening to the reader. Dialogue has to be placed inside quotation marks. Everything that is not in quotation marks, guess who's speaking? The narrator is speaking. If you do not see quotation marks around a sentence, that means the narrator is speaking. If you see quotation marks, that means a specific character is speaking. One at the beginning and one at the end of the sentence. You need to place the punctuation mark inside of the end quote. So the second quote that you put, the punctuation, whether it's a question mark, a period, a comma, that should go inside of the quotation mark. For example, please place the punctuation mark before the end quote, exclamation point. End quote, Mr. Radish demanded. Okay, so you see how I have the exclamation point inside of the quote. That is the proper way to do it. And then Mr. Radish demanded is the speaker tag ending it. Now, some people might ask, can I put a speaker tag at the beginning of the sentence? Yes, you can. However, that should be rare. It's common practice to usually have it at the end. However, there are certain opportunities that you could put it at the beginning, but make sure that's not the norm. That should not be what you do every time. Followed by the speaker tag. Now, there are other ways to say said. Here is the list I want you to use. You don't want to follow every piece of dialogue with the speaker tag blank said, because it's repetitive, it's boring, it's just not good writing. This is boring and will not add to anything to your story. Focus on what the character says and how they say it. If they're yelling, if they're surprised, if they're asking a question, these are all different ways. So think about what your character actually says, and then make sure your speaker tag matches that. Now, can you say said once in a while? Absolutely. So here are some examples. Whispered, grinned, scolded, complained, giggled, laughed, asked, yelled, cried, replied, demanded, whined, bragged, exclaimed, moaned, shrieked, and begged. These are great examples of different speaker tags you can say. I would highly recommend that you have this slideshow on another tab when you are actually writing your stories, so you can see all of these different types of speaker tags you can add. This definitely adds a lot of richness and depth to your writing when you use these words. Okay, what does a character's thoughts look like? A character's thoughts are not dialogue because the character is not actually talking to anyone. You only need to type quotation marks if a character is actually speaking. So if you're focused on a main character and they are thinking something to themselves, obviously the reader has no idea what a character is thinking unless you actually write it down. Okay, let's pretend the character is thinking to themselves. Well, how do I write that? He's not talking, he's just thinking. You will press the italics button to write thoughts of a character. So right here, that button. So when you're typing, that's the italicized button between the bold and the underline. Okay, so this is what it should look like. Why do my kids take so long to fall asleep? Mr. Radish thought. That is how you would do a thought. It should be in italics, not the speaker tag. Okay, everything else should be normal. Just the thought itself should be in italics. Okay, so what would a paragraph of dialogue look like? So if you want to see, I'm not going to read this to you because it's pretty long, but this is a little excerpt of the book To Kill a Mockingbird, which happened to be one of my favorite books reading in school when I was in, I believe I read it my freshman year of high school. Great book, highly recommended. But you can read this this little excerpt from the book and see how dialogue is properly used in a story and how it transitions from the narrator speaking to a character, and it includes all the speaker tags. Okay, so definitely read this just for some clarity on that. Now let's talk about perspective. How perspective in writing can change our view of a story. Okay, perspective is another term to explain point of view. It refers to whose eyes the story is being told through. Usually an author likes to focus on one character to follow. However, sometimes the author switches between characters and thus changing the perspective of the story. For example, think of a story or a movie that you have watched recently. Usually there's a good guy and a bad guy in most of these stories or movies. Have you ever thought about what it would be like if the story was told through the perspective of the antagonist, which is the bad guy, and not the protagonist, the good guy? So I want you to imagine this. If you've ever read Harry Potter, or if you've ever seen the movie, obviously the character that is focused on is the protagonist, the good guy, which is Harry. However, could you imagine what the story would be like if it was told through the antagonist point of view, or Voldemort in these stories or movies? It would be completely different. The same events could take place, the same exact things. However, it's through that character's point of view. So it would be just incredibly different. Almost a totally different story, even though the same things are actually happening. Now, it'll focus on what they do in between these major events, but those same things would still take place, which would be very interesting. It's fascinating, huh? All right, guys, that's it for today. Thank you so much for listening, and good luck writing in the future, and use these ideas to help you. All right, talk to you later.